This is The Corner Series, a McGuireWoods series exploring business and legal issues prevalent in today's private equity industry. Tune in with McGuireWoods partner Geoff Cockrell as he and specialists share real-world insight to help enhance your knowledge.
Thank you for joining another episode of The Corner Series. I'm your host, Geoff Cockrell, partner at McGuireWoods. Today, I'm joined by Jeremy Johnson, Senior Managing Director at Bourne Partners, where he heads the investment banking group. We're going to talk prospects for some different sectors heading here into the beginning of 2025. But Jeremy, if you could give a little introduction of yourself and of Bourne Partners.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Appreciate it, Geoff. So I run Bourne Partners Investment Bank. We are a boutique investment bank focused in the healthcare sector. The firm was started in 2001 by Banksborn. And the first 20 years of the firm, we were a merchant bank where we were investing in businesses off our own balance sheet while doing some M&A advisory business on the side. And over the past 4 or 5 years, we've separated the investment activities from the investment banking activities. And today I lead the investment bank. We're about 25 people, mostly in Charlotte, a couple in New York, a couple in Florida, focused broadly in the healthcare space, pharma services, consumer health, and then healthcare services. So things on the payer and provider side. And we're very intentionally and proactively trying to grow the investment bank over the next few years as we expand our coverage into the rest of healthcare, open office in Europe later this year, et cetera. But we work with middle market companies, a lot of family founder-owned businesses, and then also with private equity, mostly on sell side M&A and other capital advisory mandates.
It might be a good place to start just kind of focusing on healthcare services generally, and let's separate into those 3 categories you mentioned of pharma services, payer services, provider services. Those are obviously very different segments with very different kind of headwinds, tailwinds. As you look at the market here fairly early in 2025, how would you handicap those 3 different sectors of healthcare services from the perspective of kind of available targets, investor sentiment? What's your prognosis there?
Sure. Great question. So we'll tackle pharma services first, or actually I'll even take one step back. I think everyone is expecting M&A activity to be very robust in 2025. We're off our peaks in 21 and 22 where there was a lot of activity. Valuations were very high, and that slowed down quite a bit over the past couple of years. And there's a lot of private equity who've kind of sat on the sidelines waiting to sell businesses. We are seeing in some of these areas that there is definitely more activity, more talk. We were just at JP Morgan last week, the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, which is where most people in the healthcare sector kind of kick off their year and get an idea of how the year is going to play out. And one of the themes is a lot of the things that were targets or potential transactions for 24 are still the same targets on the list for 25. I think folks are expecting it to be different. But if we look at the different sectors, I still think there are some headwinds in pharma services that will cause some owners, especially private equity owners, to probably have to sit on the sidelines maybe another 6, 12, 18 months. And the biggest thing there is biopharma funding is still not back. We saw a little bit of that come back last year, but it's a bit of the case of the haves versus the have-nots. More capital was deployed, but it's bigger deals later stage. And what that's done is anyone in pharma services, so you think about clinical services, companies in the CDMO space doing development work, they're still not back to the growth levels that they would like to be. A lot of companies have been flat, still even declining in some cases. So I think most owners want to see that they're trailing 12 months, they've got growth over the prior year or the prior 12-month period before they sell that business.
Maybe on that topic within pharma services, definitely hearing some of the same headwinds from the perspective of kind of pharma funding. When there's challenges on the funding side, does that put more pressure on the earlier support, like drug exploration, like clinical trials, or does it put more pressure on the commercialization? And where does that pressure pinch first?
Yeah, it's definitely on the earlier end. And you saw really started in 23. Companies, the folks who were dependent on early stage, revenues and services to early stage biopharma, the earlier it was, the quicker and swifter and more significant to hit. And then, but you saw that trickle up to even later stage companies as well, and even some big pharma were rationalizing some of their programs and where they were going to spend their money. So we saw it impact clinical services, from preclinical all the way up to later stage clinical services companies. On the CDMO side, most people think of CDMO as manufacturing, but there's a lot of development and formulation work that goes into that is very important during the clinical phase, early clinical phase, as folks are kind of developing the formulation and preparing to scale up or ramp up production. So it's not just the commercial manufacturing. So we've seen a lot of, an impact on CDMOs and their work. And so, a lot of the folks there, these CDMOs were very hot, and, you saw companies being purchased for high teens multiples of EBITDA, north of 20x multiples of EBITDA in 2021. And, you had a double impact. You got very capital intensive businesses, and you've got a slowdown in biopharma clients. And so the cost of capital's doubled since they bought those businesses, and their revenue has slowed down. So that's actually spurred a bit of divestitures, companies having to sell off, some business units to pay down debt. And I think that will continue in the CDMO space. But the prospects, it looks like some of the biopharma funding is stabilizing. We talked to a number of CEOs as well as private equity owners of pharma services businesses, both CDMOs and clinical services at JP Morgan. And they're seeing the number of RFPs are coming back. I'm seeing that actually materialize into revenues, and growth isn't quite there yet, but they're starting to see healthier signs in their pipelines and their backlogs for new business.
Maybe switching the conversation to provider services. Provider services have had some very well publicized headwinds, whether that is kind of the implications of cost of capital with higher interest rates and the kind of balance sheet challenges that kind of came from that for many platforms, a kind of ongoing pressure from a labor perspective, just a lot of increases in the cost of getting people for a lot of these positions, and also the difficulty with some of the larger end platforms of finding ultimate or the next landing spot. Those headwinds have been pretty well discussed. I guess the question I have now is kind of from where I sit. It feels like you're seeing each of those pressures starting to improve. The cost of capital hasn't changed a whole lot, but balance sheet challenges have a way, one way or the other, sometimes without a lot of pain, sometimes with a lot of pain, but ultimately working themselves out. Labor pressures are feeling like they're declining a bit as some of the leverage on the labor side is diminishing a bit. And the emergence of new strategic buyers, it feels like those kind of well-publicized headwinds are starting to mitigate a bit. Do you concur with that mitigation, and what's your prognosis in that segment?
Yeah, I think so. I think I generally agree with all those comments. I think there's definitely some areas on the provider side where we're seeing there's a lot of interest and activity and demand and good valuations. I think some of the things that have impacted those sectors, especially on the labor side, which was very tough and very tight the past few years, has definitely started to, I guess, kind of get under control, if you will. But we're seeing, it's not across all sectors. I think if you ask most, they would say there's been too many practice management roll-ups, and it's going to be hard for private equity to unwind every single one of those deals successfully. I think there are some areas that will probably do better than others, but I think there will be some pressure in that space. And some of that just has to do with that model in general. But where we're seeing some activity on our healthcare services side of the business, they're seeing a lot of interest on the behavioral health side. We've been doing a bit of work that in general, substance abuse, autism, there's some real strong interest there and good activity. We're seeing a bit on I guess it's more pharmacy services. The infusion space is very, very hot right now. And that market is being driven by the biopharma space and new medications and a lot of these more complicated, complex medications require infusion for delivery, and so that's a space that is anticipated to continue to grow. And we're seeing innovations in that space, from home-based infusion to sites and mixes of that. So there's been a number of kind of high-profile transactions there at very good valuations, high teens, multiples of EBITDA, which is very frothy. Where we're seeing some pressures on valuations in some other areas.
As I look at that, and I agree with that, and as I try to look for kind of through lines in some of those sectors, the through lines that come to me are looking for businesses in provider services that are not doctor-led, that the challenges around establishing and maintaining alignment with doctor providers is difficult. I think we might come back to it. There's some evolving thinking on how to go about that I think can be powerful in kind of establishing and maintaining doctor alignment. But I think there's a lot of interest in services that are not doctor-led. So your behavioral health has some of those dynamics, and other places do. And then the second through line in some of those, as I look at that, is businesses that are focused on kind of site of service, moving things away from more expensive areas to cheaper areas, whether that's home health, hospice, a lot of home-based investing, so home health, hospice. Many infusion businesses have similar dynamics. So as I kind of try to look for through lines, those are some that I see. Do you see any other kind of unifying themes to kind of segregate out the areas that have kind of heightened interest versus kind of still languishing in some of the headwinds?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that is improving outcomes and lowering cost is of interest in driving some of that demand, and where there's good activity. And this kind of goes across all of healthcare, but anything that gets closer, the product or the service closer to the patient that's where everything is going. COVID actually spurred a lot of that. It was the big negative that was needed to actually allow telemedicine to finally kind of break through and be reimbursed at a level that made it supportable. But the patients want that, and they're demanding that, and so it's allowed it to stay and continue to grow and thrive. And I don't think you're going to see going away from that. I still see all the hospitals in town building massive, expensive hospitals and expanding them, and as they want to try to create revenue centers. But I think the industry on a whole is trying to get closer to the patient and take cost out of the system while continuing to improve care and outcomes, et cetera.
I think your assessment is correct on investments that focus on the kind of triple policy aims of improving outcomes, improving access, and mitigating the cost trajectory of the systemic cost trajectory. Those will continue to be the focus. And it was super interesting being out at JP Morgan, having conversations with, in particular, some of the kind of the consulting groups that are out there. Everyone is trying to assess kind of, well, where does private equity fit in this? They've gotten a lot of black eyes in some of the media accounts, and talking with some of the groups out there, they're starting to amass real data where they can much more cleanly answer questions of, in particular with providers, of like, what's the cost impact of private equity-based provider groups versus, and then the other two kind of measure points would be kind of hospital-based provider groups or independent provider groups. And the easy narrative from anecdotal bits that you see in the press is often, well, the private equity groups are bad on that across the board. And the data is starting to be amassed in a very more serious and deliberative way that is painting a very different picture that is much more beneficial. Because it was always difficult to hear some of the darker narratives that just don't align with kind of what my experience has been and the people that I know. That I don't know any business that is tolerant of bad outcomes or it takes a lot of solace in really jacking payer rates, or even has the kind of market power to even consider that. Yet that was such a driving narrative in the press for a while. It's been good to see some of the more kind of fact-based presentations start to hopefully take hold.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things that our research team is trying to keep their eyes on a bit as we think about 2025 and beyond is the potential impacts from the new administration and some of what are they going to focus on? And I think they've been there's been commentary around trying to cut costs, Medicare and Medicaid. You got the continuation of the IRA and the impact on negotiated drug pricing and what's going to be the impact there. So those are some things that we're also monitoring as the new administration is looking at ways to kind of cut some costs out of the system, and how is that going to impact existing businesses and the way the overall healthcare kind of system or ecosystem works today.
Maybe switching to the last healthcare services sector that we mentioned and going to payer services. It was also interesting to hear some of the investment thesis around that space from investors out in San Francisco. It feels like a bit smaller of a segment, but that may be deceptive. What are your assessment of some of the opportunities and how to think about a thesis in those spaces from an investor perspective?
Yeah, so I think on the payer services side, I think when you look at that, I mean, one thing I'll lump into just payer services in general. There's a right now the biggest what's making the most noise in the market is everything around PBMs, and they've been under scrutiny here for a while, and it looks like there's going to be some real kind of reform and change there, and it's universal. It's kind of been shown that they have not been taking cost out of the system. They've been taking profits out of the system or making profits, via the system and the complexities, et cetera. And so I think that sort of that pressure, that disruption is going to create some opportunity. I think whenever you have big pressures, big disruptions, it creates opportunity for innovation, change. And so whether that's technologies that help, as a lot of systems are moving to performance-based and outcomes-based, payment models, technologies and services to monitor that and track that. There's definitely, an opportunity there. So that's one of the things that we're kind of keeping our eyes on. Most of our activity this year, where we're seeing the greatest amount of activity from an M&A standpoint and transaction standpoint, is more on the provider and the pharma services space. So probably don't have as many data points on the payer side and payer technology to discuss, but I do think there's going to be a lot of shakeup and interesting outcomes, with how the whole PBM shakeup happens.
Yeah, it's hard to know how to make investments in the PBM space other than, as everyone kind of looks forward, the kind of market control of the three big PBMs. It controls of how so much of drug delivery happens, as if there's an expectation that market power at some level is going to be deconstructed. It's hard to know, A, when exactly that will happen, and B, how do you position yourself to be present for what happens next, let alone figuring out, well, what will happen next. You can see the future coming, but it's not quite here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the prior administration was really being, aggressive and kind of, from a SEC, FTC, HSR standpoint, and looking to make it more difficult, for M&A, especially within the healthcare space. Pharma has been a target. Part of the problem is it's almost too late, because you've had these oligopolies created where you've had the verticalization of the payer, the provider, and the wholesalers, where you've got so few kind of controlling the entire pharma ecosystem. And I don't think this administration is going to go and start breaking up these businesses, but I think there's definitely pressure in and around the PBMs, and Trump has stated that they intend to kind of go after the middlemen. So we'll see what happens. But look at how long ago did Amazon buy PillPack? It's been many years now, and if Amazon has not yet been able to disrupt and truly change the pharma ecosystem, which they've been able to disrupt everything else pretty easily. It just goes to show you how entrenched that is, and how it's not an easy job to change that. I think it does. Things need to be changed, and I think there's definitely some pressures. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, the incoming administration is a little bit enigmatic on some of these topics, and the forces within that administration are not always exactly aligned. You've got kind of the economic populist camp where J.D. Vance was a big fan of Lena Khan's, which on its face sounds odd until you kind of unpack it a little bit. And so economic populism might be looking for more kind of antitrust separation of some of these things, whereas kind of the pro-big business side of that camp, which is focused right now more heavily on tech stuff, but there's certainly that arm within the administration and certainly within the Republican Party might look for less antitrust intervention. It'll be super interesting to see how some of those things play out.
Yeah, I think it'll be generally. I think it'll be good for M&A in general, but more lenient than last couple of years. However, I think there will be some targeted efforts to prevent or break up some areas. I think that's and a lot of that's going to be on PBMs and folks in the middle that are driving up costs and making profits, as opposed to actually lowering costs and improving outcomes.
There are a lot of topics we could talk about, but I think we'll probably end it there. This has been super fun, super interesting, and Jeremy, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, and this was great.
Thank you for joining us on this installment of the Corner Series. To learn more about today's discussion, please email host Geoff Cockrell at gcockrell@McGuireWoods.com. We look forward to hearing from you. This series was recorded and is being made available by McGuireWoods for informational purposes only. By accessing this series, you acknowledge that McGuireWoods makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this installment. The views, information, or opinions expressed are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of McGuireWoods. This series should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney in your state and should not be construed as an offer to make or consider any investment or course of action.